Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm really delighted that you have been able to join us this evening, and I hope this evening will give you a lot of very useful information. So really, without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker. Just before I do that, I think it's really important that we recognize that across the country, there are many navigation authorities who are responsible for maintaining our waterways, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude for all that they do for us. And I'm delighted that our representatives of 4 great independent navigation authorities are with us this evening. So, James, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So good evening, everybody. I recognise quite a few names in the bar that I recognise. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm James Taylor. I'm the strategic manager for the Basingstoke Canal. I work for Surrey and Hampshire County Councils, the owners of the Basingstoke Canal. So my first slide is really just a little bit of background about what the Basingstoke Canal is and where it is. It runs from the Riverway navigation, one of the older river navigations in the country, up into central Hampshire, originally terminated in the centre of Basingstoke. And it's a typical canal mania area canal built in the 1790s, designed, in our case, to take agricultural goods and timber and things like that to the central London docks. And to receive finished products back in the other direction. It's very much a canal of 2 halves. The first half of the canal is climbing steeply out of the Riverway navigation, Riverway Valley, and this is the half of the canal that's in Surrey. At Frimley, it turns and goes along the side of the river Blackwater Valley and then crosses that and continues to be a contour canal all the way through Hampshire. So it is almost exactly half and half in Surrey and Hampshire. The last 5 miles of the canal beyond the Greywell Tunnel were lost in abandonment in the 1930s when private owners of the canal decided they could no longer maintain that section. And various developments in around Basingstoke since that really means the last 5 miles are now no more than a walking route that I know our colleagues in the Canal Society are working very keenly on. So 32 miles of navigable waterway across Surrey and Hampshire from the Riverway to Greywell. Now that the nature of the canal being climbing first and then being a contour canal means there's a lot of assets for us to maintain. 28 locks in Surrey, 1 in Hampshire. We've got aqueducts and about 60% of the canal is raised above ground level. The Basingstoke Canal had something of a checkered history, being the original canal company being wound up in the middle of the 19th century, and various private owners owned it then throughout the 20th century. If you ever want to know more about the Basingstoke Canal, I suggest you listen to one of the Canal Society volunteers who does a talk called Heroes and Villains of the Basingstoke Canal. I don't think he's updated it yet to decide whether I fit into either of those categories. So by the middle of the 20th century, 1960s, the Basingstoke Canal was in a pretty sorry state. The final private owners really didn't have the money to keep it in repair, and a campaign was started by the Canal Society to try and save it for future posterity. And that they persuaded the county councils of Surrey and Hampshire to buy the canal in 1974. So the county councils of Surrey and Hampshire own the canal within each of their jurisdictions. It's operated very much as a partnership. And rather than running the waterway themselves, they have a managing agent called the Basingstoke Canal Authority, which is a partnership that runs the waterway on a day-to-day basis. It carries out operational maintenance and manages water levels and manages visitor services. The partnership is made up of local authorities, so Surrey and Hampshire, the two owners, but also 6 district and borough councils and some parish and town councils. And they all support the Basingstoke Canal Authority through revenue grants. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The other people who I've already mentioned several times are the Basingstoke Canal Society. The Society are the organisation that have campaigned for the canal over, well, more than 50 years now. And they provide us a huge amount of support through their volunteers. So some key things about the Basingstoke Canal and the key themes that we do on the canal. It's about asset management. Those assets that I mentioned earlier are now over 225 years old, and it's trying to keep them in a safe and satisfactory condition. It's about operations. Like a lot of canals, you can't just take your eye off the ball with the Basingstoke Canal, and water levels need to be managed throughout the year. In fact, we have a member of staff on duty 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's also about providing visitor services. This is the core reason that the county councils actually own the waterway in the first place. It's providing a green space for visitors' health and well-being. And we have a huge range of visitors on the canal, walking and cycling, in kayaks and paddleboards and canoes, and of course, in powered boats as well. The other unusual feature of the Basingstoke Canal is that it's most of it, 90% of it, is a site of special scientific interest. And so as public owners of the canal, Surrey and Hampshire County Councils have statutory duties in order to conserve and enhance nature conservation. So some facts and figures. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that all of the funds that go into the Basingstoke Canal are local. We don't get funding from central government to manage the waterway in any shape or form. Currently, the two county council owners are investing and have an investment programme in keeping those assets in good condition. So our capital investment programme is currently not under threat. But local authority revenue budgets, that's the money used to pay staff and buy consumable items, is very much a pressure point. And staffing, of course, is the major cost of the Basingstoke Canal Authority. It's about 68% of our costs are staffing costs. Since 2011, when I got involved in the canal, the Canal Authority has done a wonderful job in re-envisaging itself as its income generation stream, and actually generating more income from activities on the waterway. That's through making sure its licensing charges are in line with other people's, and also by doing much more visitor service operations. So from we now generate about a third of our income from income generating activities, or third revenue from income generating activities. Since the COVID pandemic came along last year, and we've had a very strange 12 months, we've seen the peaks of use through the lockdowns as people local to the canal use it very much more. And we've seen during the summer, we saw a huge rise in unpowered boat traffic. But of course, the majority of our users are using the towpath on foot. And we've seen peaks on our counters of over 300% of normal use. Now that's both a threat to the fabric of the canal, but also an opportunity to help us increase income generation. The final thing point I'd make is and though we have lots of staffing costs, we are helped to maintain the canal by a huge range of volunteers, mostly from the Canal Authority, but from Canal Society, but from other organisations as well. And as you can see there, last year there was over 3,500 volunteering days on the canal. And I think that's my initial thoughts on that, and I'm sure lots of people will have questions about my presentation. But I think that's my thoughts for the time being.
Great. Thank you very much, James. I'm now going to invite John to share the Broads story with us. Thank you, John.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the IWA for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. And I always like to start my talks and finish them with a picture of the Broads to remind me and my staff what we're here for. So the Broads has 125 miles of lock-free navigation with over 60 shallow lakes, which were formed as a result of medieval peat digging. The system is not a natural system and therefore requires a huge amount of maintenance, both to retain its very special nature conservation value, but also to maintain water depths for navigation. It's of huge economic importance to Norfolk and Suffolk, contributing over £600 million to the local economy and over 7,000 jobs. But if we're going to understand the issue about funding, then we need to look back a bit at the history and understand where the Broads Authority came from. So we need to go back to 1947 and the report by Sir Arthur Hobhouse, when he was asked to identify areas in England and Wales and Scotland that were appropriate to become national parks. And he identified 12. One of those was the Broads. And you can read this lovely piece of prose from his report. The Broads have a special claim to selection as a national park, quite apart from their natural beauty, by reason of their holiday and recreational value and the interest of their plant and animal life. On this great system of waterways, which lies within 4 hours train journey of London, thousands of people annually enjoy the quiet adventure and refreshment of waterborne holidays under sail or in cabin cruises, while others find waterside accommodation with small boats sailing, fishing or bathing at their garden's end. The Broads are a perfect nursery for the yachtsman. So in that, he's encapsulated some of the key things about the beauty of the landscape, the importance for holidays and recreation, and the value, particularly of its wildlife and the special qualities in terms of sailing and boating. And in 1950, a committee was set up to look at designating the Broads as a national park. And although the committee considered that the Broads merited that designation, they decided it was too expensive, and therefore the Broads missed out. And I think that's a hint as to the sorts of costs that we are still having to deal with today. And in the 60s and the 70s, there was a rapid decline in water quality as a result of phosphorus. And it wasn't until 1988 that the Broads was given the status of a national park and the Broads Authority was established with the powers and responsibilities of a national park authority, but the important responsibilities as a navigation authority and a harbour authority. And for this evening's purpose, it's important that we understand that in that act, there was a separation in terms of the funding of national park functions and the funding of navigation. And that is being maintained. And when we took a private bill through Parliament, the key element in terms of the discussion with ministers at the time was that ministers thought that the use of the navigation was not a public benefit, but a private benefit, and therefore it ought to be funded from tolls paid by the charges by people who use the waterways, rather than having support from the national purse. So the Broads Authority receives funding principally from two different directions. And the next slide shows you the sorts of sums that we're dealing with. It receives National Park grant for its national park purposes, and then it receives income from its 12,000 boats that use the system. And those incomes are separate, as is the expenditure. So National Park grant generally cannot be spent on maintaining the navigation, and income from boats cannot be spent on functions like promoting the enjoyment of the area. Total income is about 8 million. We get another £1 million from other sources to support our national park work. Now, in terms of the COVID crisis, that has obviously had a dramatic effect on the country as a whole and on our navigations. In terms of the Broads, this is the result of some specific work we did in surveying our high boat companies. Our day boat operators actually perform rather better than the weekly hired boats and the passenger boats. So after the initial period when everything was locked down, we, like the Basingstoke and others, experienced a huge uplift in visitors, many who hadn't been to the Broads before. Other factors which are important when looking at funding for the Broads is that there has been a long-term decline in the number of weekly hired cruisers on the Broads. There were 2,300 in the 1980s. We're now down to 800, and they are continuing to shrink such that the reduction in numbers is the income from that when they're sold is then used, plowed back into invest into new hire boats. But the number of new hire boats is less than the ones that we're losing. Our bookings for 2021 are significantly up, but there's huge uncertainty about what 2021 is going to look like. So picking up on the points from about the Basingstoke, we've seen a big change in terms of numbers of boats. And here I've highlighted for you two particular features. One is that loss of those motor cruisers, 149, but then under rowing craft, you'll see there's been a 16% increase. Many of that includes paddleboards, kayaks, canoes, where we've seen a huge upswell and a very welcome uptake, particularly by local young people who hadn't used the Broads in the past, but have bought a paddleboard and got out. And that's caused an increase in those numbers. Sorry, I confused you in that last slide. I was talking about private motor boats, which were down, but here's the next slide, which is about hire boats. And you can see here, we've lost 65 hired motorboats, and overall a 10%, nearly 11% loss in hire boat numbers as a whole. So here's our predicted income for this current year. And you can see our navigation income is down by well over 100,000. Now, to accommodate that, we've also had to come back on our expenditure by a similar amount. In fact, we've cut back more on our expenditure, so our closing reserves will be slightly higher than we predicted. So in these changing times, what are our key priorities when we're thinking about what needs funding? And obviously the first one is the maintenance of the system. And dredging is the largest part of that operation, but there's also maintenance of moorings, plant cutting and patrolling. Now, partly as a result of the increase in new visitors to the Broads that we saw when the COVID restrictions were lifted, we saw a significant rise in the number of accidents. And unfortunately, we had 4 fatal accidents in a relatively short space of time, one of which is being investigated by the Marine Accident Investigation Branch of the DTI. So as a result of that, the Broads Authority has drawn up a package of measures, which includes producing 9 short videos for new hirers to view at home before they come to the Broads, and an increase in our ranger staff to increase patrolling, such that we've got more people out on the rivers and Broads to give advice. We also have an issue in terms of we're starting work on upgrading our toll system. So in terms, given that normally all the costs of maintaining the navigation are funded out of the income from tolls, we were looking at a 7% increase in charges to both maintain the existing services, but also to fund that important package of safety measures. We thought 7% was rather high in these particularly difficult times for people. And therefore, exceptionally, we went to DEFRA and asked for consent on a once-only basis to use money from our national park reserves to fund these safety measures. Fortunately, DEFRA has agreed to that, which means that tolls in the Broads will rise by 4% next year. And this is what 4% looks like. For 67% of 2/3 of all those boats on the Broads, that's less than an extra £10 per annum for next year. So finally, I've put together a list of what I think are the 8 key financial challenges going forward. I've mentioned the restructuring of the hire boat industry, which has an impact on our income. We're facing a higher level of maintenance of this critical system because of climate change. That requires more dredging, more plant cutting. We also need to extend our network of electric charging points if we are going to meet the challenge of reducing the amount of carbon that we produce, and that's very expensive. And then there is this, what I think is the fundamental point, which is that the maintenance of these waterways is for public benefit. It's not just a private benefit. So those many millions of visitors who come to the Broads can go on a trip boat or a day boat, and they benefit from the fact that we're maintaining this very special place for them. Our National Park grant hasn't kept pace with inflation. And so in future, although it can bail this out this year, that's not going to be able to be repeated. We also have a very complex financial system because we have to keep separate our income from National Park grant and income from tolls. That costs us in terms of time and resource. And we also have a very complex auditing system. But also we've got huge uncertainties going forward. So if we are going to look after the Broads in an environment where climate change is making things more difficult and we want more people to come and enjoy it, then we do need to find an argument to put to government to convince them that this is a public benefit, not just a private one. So thank you, Paul. As I promised, I'm finishing with a slide of Hickling Broad just to whet your appetite and hope you'll be able to come to enjoy the Broads at some point in the coming years. Thank you.
John, thank you very much, and a wonderfully complete set of slides, and I'm sure that they will trigger some questions. And so I would encourage anybody that's got any questions from the previous 2 presentations to start putting those into the Q&A box. And now I'm just going to hand over to Mark Stoneham. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the Chichester Ship Canal Trust. Thank you, Mark.
Paul, thank you, and thank you for the invite to come along. Next slide, please. This is my first involvement in an event like this. So my name is Mark Stoneham. I'm the Vice Chair of the Chichester Ship Canal. Joined in 2018 after retiring from a 30-year career in ExxonMobil at various places around the world. We have a small trustee team looking after the specific objectives and charitable objectives of the organisation. And we manage day-to-day a trading company that's running our day-to-day operation. Our canal is almost 200 years old. We celebrate our 200th birthday in 2022, hence the heading 200,000 by 2022. We're part of the old London to Portsmouth Waterway, and our canal runs from the basin in the centre of the city in Chichester, the picture you can see here, to the marina some 4 miles away. We lease 3 of the 4 miles from West Sussex County Council, and we have an accessible towpath along the distance and navigation for 1.8 miles, along which we run boat trips. And you can see Richmond and Kingfisher, the 2 boats there in the picture up on the screen. Next slide, please. In terms of our day-to-day operation, the towpath is a public right-of-way, so our responsibility to the local authority is to keep it clear so that it can be used by members of the public. We offer trip boats, about 1,000 trips a year, including 100 at Christmas. We've got about 15 table cafe, a small museum, and 10 rowboats that we hire. We provide licenses for paddleboarding, which is becoming increasingly popular, for canoeing, and also for angling. The waterway, the banks, and the margins of the towpath we maintain by a work party, and you can see that lovely group of men and women there. Tuesday and Thursday morning, we get about 20-25 people who come down and carry out that work. Overall, we have 170 volunteers registered, and 4 part-time staff who run our cafe and look after our computer systems. 2019, a typical year, we had 15,000 boat trips and 35,000 visits to the cafe. And that generated about £300,000 revenue. 2020, the boat income was almost eliminated. The cafe dipped, but we did manage to maintain the takeaway cafe. So we probably went down about 20% in the cafe. The rowboats, etc., were popular whilst government restrictions allowed, but during the period of lockdown, we have been unable to do that. The next slide is simply about the bank work. The reason we need to raise money is to deliver essential repairs to the canal banks. And in summary, to go quickly through this slide, we broadly got £200,000 worth of work over a 5-year period, and we're about to come into year 3 of year 5 and have done a minimal amount of work. So that's the business need for funding that we have. Next slide. And finally, the funding. We are different to my colleagues on the call, a wholly funded, self-funded charity. We generate our income from member subscriptions, about 4,000 a year, from donations, 5,000 to 10,000 a year, and the remainder is money generated by our trading operation, around 50,000 to 70,000 pounds a year, that's transferred over to us as a gift aid, and we reinvest in our operation. As I said, our income has been significantly impacted in 2020, and we start 2021 with everything absolutely closed down. So through the back end of 2020, we launched a crowdfunding campaign to raise our profile locally. Our target was to raise 10,000 before the end of the year, which we achieved. We've now moved over to a Just Giving website and have raised about another 1,500 from the public. We featured in local media, we featured heavily in social media, and we have 3 patrons who are there to try to generate interest around the local community. As we speak, we have about 100,000 that we have generated, including 25,000 of our reserves, around 20,000 from the local authorities, from one grant or another, and around 40,000 from the Swire organisation as a charitable donation. That's all I have to say today, so I welcome any comments or questions as we move through the Q&A later. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mark. And now just to finally move to our final presentation, I'd like to invite Mark Baker to share screen. Mark, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'm just sharing my screen. So, my name is Mark Baker. I'm the Canal Manager of the Grand Western Canal Country Park and Local Nature Reserve, which is owned by Devon County Council. Has been since 1971 when it took it on from the British Waterways Board, and it's managed in partnership with Mid Devon District Council. It's located close to the Somerset border in Devon. It runs for 11.25 miles from the market town of Tiverton, close to the Somerset border. It once continued through to the Bridgewater and Taunton Canal at Taunton, but that section was abandoned in the mid-1800s when the railway came. We do have a friends group, the Friends of the Grand Western Canal, formerly the Grand Western Canal Trust, who have an interest in that disused section in Somerset, as well as the in-water section in Devon. But my focus is purely on the in-water section in Devon. So this is that section. It runs for 11.25 miles from Tiverton. The first mile is in the town, and then you're out into open countryside, passing through some small villages until it stops at Loudwells, which is a little hamlet. It actually ends in the middle of the first lock on the route down to Taunton. There's a 260-foot drop down to Taunton, but the section that's in Devon is a contour canal, so it's all on a contour. As you can see, lots of bridges. There's an aqueduct and a tunnel as well. And some of those bridges, like the one you see here, are lovely John Rennie bridges that are Grade 2 listed, along with many other features that are Grade 2 listed along the canal. Canal's very busy visitor attraction, important for local people as well, for accessing green space. Boating, fishing, cycling, walking are all very popular. You do need a permit to fish or to use a boat. We have fairly low levels of boating on the canal, given it's an isolated stretch. That probably explains why. But we have built a slipway, and we've hosted a couple of IWA national trailboat festivals over the years, in the last 15 years, in an attempt to try and encourage more boating. What we are seeing at the moment, particularly last year, is a massive increase in unpowered boating. So lots more canoes, kayaks and paddleboards, just as John said they're finding in the Broads as well. The towpath is a public right of way and a permissive cycleway as well. And National Cycle Route 3 follows much of the towpath. Perhaps what the canal is best known for is the horse-drawn barge, Tivertonian, which has been operating on the canal since 1974. The current company that run it, the Tiverton Canal Company, are based in the Canal Basin in Tiverton, which is pictured in the bottom left photo there. And they also run a floating cafe, boat hire and a gift shop from the Canal Basin. We have a visitor centre and also a play area. You can see the canal themed play area there on the bottom right. So that's the Honeypot site, and it's the busiest area of the canal. The canal is managed by a ranger service, so that comprises of myself as the canal manager and 2 rangers. So there's just 3 of us, 3 staff that look after the whole canal, but we are helped by lots of volunteers. Most weekdays we have 1 or 2 volunteers or work experience students that work alongside us, and then we have occasional work parties where we have bigger groups of volunteers. We're also supported by the Friends group, who have their own volunteers that act as voluntary wardens and also undertake practical tasks from time to time. So the rangers look after pretty much all of the practical work along the canal: tree management, hedge management, weed management. The weed in particular is taking more and more of our time. We've got some nasty invasive weeds, water soldier in particular, which has massively increased our workload in terms of keeping the canal clear of weed. But we do our best to keep on top of that. We're supported by contractors that undertake some specialist maintenance tasks as well. And as well as the basic maintenance of the canal, the Ranger Service also runs a series of events, and we engage with local schools with ranger-led visits. So all-rounders really, and we're on hand in the Canal Basin to deal with any queries that people have. You may recall that there was a major breach of one of our embankments back in 2012. During the storms in November of that year, the canal overtopped at several points, massive flooding throughout the southwest of England. And unfortunately, we were just inundated. More water was flooding in from local streams that were overtopping their banks than we could let out. And as a result, the canal overtopped at several points, and unfortunately at the highest embankment of the whole canal, it actually started to wear through the soil embankment and breached. So fortunately, Devon County Council, seeing the value of the canal and the importance to the local economy in particular, quickly acted to commit the funds to repair the embankment. That repair took place in time for our bicentenary in 2014. And as well as doing the repairs, we also received significant extra funding to upgrade our water management system. You can see some new sluices being installed on the left here, and also a tilting weir on the right hand side. And that has increased our outfall capacity by a factor of 5. And that's what our consultants believe that we need now and for the future. So we really didn't have enough before. And had the breach not happened in 2012, then there's a good chance it might have happened since. So yes, we've done fairly well as far as capital funding is concerned. This is a graph that shows the capital funding over the last 18 years. So we've had funding for dredging and the breach repairs and culvert works and various other things, mostly from Devon County Council. And so as far as capital funding is concerned, we've done fairly well. But it's revenue funding that's the concern. We have seen a decline in revenue funding. Maybe not as severe as some other places, but a decline nonetheless. And on the right hand side, you can see the breakdown of funding, with Mid Devon giving roughly a quarter. That was once half of our funding that they provided, but that's declined. We've significantly increased the amount of income that we generate over the years to roughly a third now, and Devon County provide the rest. So, like I say, it might not look so bad, you know, being relatively flat level of revenue over the last few years, but what isn't shown through that is the effect of our overheads being increased. So we've seen new charges levied both by Devon County Council departments recharging for their services, and also by Mid Devon District Council charging for services that it previously provided free of charge as part of the partnership arrangement. So for instance, emptying the bins, as of this year, we're having to spend £7,000 on having those emptied. And the net effect, combined with the cuts, is that our remaining budget to equip the rangers to do their work is significantly reduced. This just shows a breakdown of our income, where it's generated from. As you can see, car parking income is the biggest contributor, although that's markedly down over the last year because substantially fewer visitors have been arriving at the canal basin. The Tiverton Canal Company didn't operate last year because of COVID, and that's taken away a lot of the visitors that would have come to this part of the canal. The rest of the canal has been busier than ever. All of our outlying car parks, where there's no pay and display, have been absolutely packed. But the canal basin car park has been quieter. The other main contributors are lease income from the various businesses that operate on the canal and boat permit sales. So looking ahead, I guess our main concerns are about revenue funding continuing to be reduced. You know, with all the spending that's going on at the moment in response to COVID, you have to be concerned that there'll be another period of austerity, with local authorities starting in a very impoverished position already. If their funding is further reduced, because management of the canal isn't a statutory service, it does put us near the front of the queue when local government's having to make difficult choices about funding cuts. So that is a concern. And also, because we're operating on a shoestring, just 3 of us, flat out just keeping on top of the management of the canal, it does mean we've got very limited resources to try and pursue other funding arrangements, funding models. So our focus is mainly on defending our current funding, showing value for money, and also seeking external funding for as many different things as we can. So that's how we're coping at the moment. But obviously, I'll be keen to hear anybody else's ideas for how we can defend our revenue funding in future. So that's me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. And I'm going to invite the other presenters to turn their cameras on. And actually, Mark, yeah, your camera was off during that session. So yeah, if you are able to turn your camera on, that would be great. So we can hear you anyway, even if you're not in screen. And I'd really like to thank everyone for your questions. Now, we've probably got more questions than we're going to be able to deal with in the next 20 minutes or so. I am actually going to let the session run over perhaps by 5 or even 10 minutes, because we've got so many questions, and I'm hoping that our panelists are going to be able to stay with us for those for that extra time. I would say we'll take more questions, so keep them coming, because if we don't answer them tonight, we'll try and get answers to you when we put this recorded session up on the IWA TV channel. So I also mentioned in the chat that you can vote the questions up the leaderboard by giving them a like or a thumbs up on the Q&A screen. And I'm going to prioritize those questions that are really focusing in on the core subject tonight around funding of our navigation authorities. So I'm going to jump in just with both feet here in a question that has been voted right to the top of the leaderboard by former IWA National Chair Ivor Kaplan, and he's saying there's 4 really interesting presentations. Every organization's got a different management and funding streams, and actually one of the things that came through to me was that everyone's got a different story. But here's this controversial question. Would your navigation authority be more secure under one national body funding all waterways for the public benefit, as was the original aspiration of the IWA founders? So who wants to take that one? John, I'll go to you first.
Well, it's a really interesting question, because there's a parallel question in relation to national parks. So there are 15 national parks in the UK. They're all individual, locally run organizations. And there's, of course, a very different model in the United States, where in the USA, there is a national service, and all the parks are a federal service. The land is all owned by the government. And it works well in the United States. But I have to say, in this country, because of the nature of our country and the huge difference between the national parks, our collective view has always been that a single national park service probably would not be able to respect the local differences that each of the parks have and the engagement with their local communities. And I must say, having listened to James and the 2 Marks, what strikes me is how well connected they are with their local communities, what with their volunteers and their local society. And I think it would be, there's a huge benefit in that engagement in the local area. So it may seem a rather simple, I think it's a rather simplistic idea that you have one organization that runs everything, but actually I think you miss a huge trick in terms of the sheer variety and the local skills and passion that are generated in Chichester and Basingstoke and for the Great Western Canal. What came out for me was actually what's important is collaboration, because the 4 of us actually share a lot of common problems. You know, the invasive species, how do we encourage more of those young people to stay with us? So I think a more important route is AINA, the Association of Inland Navigation Authorities. It's collaboration and working together that's important. So I would encourage all navigation authorities to join AINA and use that as the path to working together.
I'm going to bring James in on that. You're nodding, James, and what are your reflections on that?
I agree with a lot of what John has said there, because there is that distinctive localness about a lot of the smaller waterways, and a lot of them have had to be fought for. You know, they were canals or waterways that were derelict and in danger of being lost, and those people hold those waterways very precious. In terms of our waterway, yes, we have explored with Canal and River Trust about whether we would sit comfortably in that family, and I think we just realised how difficult it is to cost running a waterway through that process, and our engagement with volunteers, I think, covers a lot of costs that perhaps Canal and River Trust actually have to pay for. So I think John's right. I think it's it's not a simple question. Yes, would a single body, an expanded Canal and River Trust, for example, be a better organisation? Well, maybe not, I think, is the answer to that. There are arguments in both directions, and I would also echo John's point about the navigation authorities, the ones that are operating operable waterways. I would encourage them to join AINA, of which I'm currently the vice chair. It's a body where we can all share our experiences and learn from one another, and grow and provide a better service.
So there's been a couple of questions. Thank you, John and James, for that. And if the others want to come in, I'll bring you in a moment. But actually, James, you touched on the British Waterways Canal and River Trust issue there. And we've got a question on that. I'm not going to specifically go into that very specific question because I want to combine it with another question in terms of what are the opportunities for authorities to work together more and potentially achieving financial savings, perhaps even going as far as through mergers or rationalization. Is it just a case of having common voice, or is it a case that there are actually some consolidation, perhaps across the navigation authorities, might be needed? But as John says, reflecting some of the more localization and the diversity that we've got across our national waterways ecosystem. What are your thoughts on that, James? And then I'll bring Mark in as well.
If you were going to sort of merge or combine navigation authority into a national body, I can see some sense in that. It's as I say, it's something we've actively explored ourselves. In terms of combining waterways, other than that, they're quite geographically spread out across the country, and there aren't, to my mind, obvious synergies, with a couple of exceptions.
Okay, and Mark Stoneham, I'll bring you in first, and then I'll go to Mark Baker on that.
Thanks. I mean, I think, I'm relatively new to Chichester, but what I really feel is that with the volunteers and the people who've worked there over the last 30 years, taking it from an abandoned canal to what it is today, there is an intense local pride in what we've done. And I think we need to move to the next level because we have urgent funding needs that we've outlined, but I wouldn't want to lose our own local identity and our reach into the local community that's been very popular. Having said that, we've taken part in this event tonight, and I think there are other things that we can benefit from doing and taking some of that learning back. So that's where I would see some synergies.
Great, thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be lovely if there was a national organisation that was going to pay for everything, as long as they let us get on with it locally as we do at the moment. I agree with the other speakers that it's the local distinctiveness and ability to react to local pressures to get to know the people locally, that really makes it special. And I'm worried that would be lost if we were merged with other waterways. We're a member of ANA, and we value that, and I agree that that's a great way to kind of share best practice. And I think waterways can do that independently as well. For instance, myself and James have shared documents, shared our best practice with each other over the years, and I think there's nothing to stop waterways from doing that. But yeah, I agree, it's difficult to see obvious areas where we could merge further.
Well, it's really good to get that breadth of reflections on that pretty challenging question. And I think there's no one size fits all answer. There is an opportunity to engage nationally. There's an opportunity to engage through common bodies, and it seems to be the opportunity to engage on a bilateral basis as well. The core of all that is we need to be talking. We all need to recognize that we're facing common issues, and where we can work together seems to be the way. So thank you for that. I'm going to move specifically into the whole concept of funding and funding sources. John, you raised a really interesting point about this public benefit, private benefit issue. And I think that is a fundamental point. We've had a really good question that's come through privately to me earlier in relation to funding of the Scottish waterways, and also within the context of what we're going to be almost certainly seeing in terms of access to public funding over the next few years. But John, I noticed that your figures for 2021 and 21-22 were level. Kind of don't want to put any dampers on that, but yeah, that's good luck with that, because it's going to be a challenging one for everyone. So how do we really get to the bottom of this balance of if the funding is lower, how do we prioritize what the navigation authorities are going to be spending their money on? Because we saw in the situation where after having raised lots of money in Scotland, the basic infrastructure and maintenance was not where the money went. And it actually caused a situation where that needed to be exposed. And once it was exposed, thankfully, it allowed for the second reopening of the Scottish waterways. How are you going to balance those needs in terms of just making sure those basic statutory essential activities are done? James, I'll go to you first.
I think it's actually already a place we've already been to. If people know about the sort of recent history of the Basingstoke Canal, in 2008, the canal was largely closed because there'd been underinvestment from the period when the canal reopened. And there was a really sharp intake of breath and a rethinking in 2008, 2010, and we've now got sort of capital plans and things in place to make sure that those assets are kept in a satisfactory condition. So I think we've already been through that wake-up sort of process that the questioner is asking about for the Scottish canals, and I think it's something that the two owners, the two county councils, are very, very aware of, very alive to. That they have obligations now. They own these assets and have to maintain them. Abandoning them in our case is not an option. We've looked at that. During that process of considering where we are at in more than 10 years ago.
Jane, John, I'll bring you in, and then again, conscious of time, some quick answers, and then I'll bring both Marks in again as well. John.
2 points from me. One is, and I think you've pointed to this a bit, Paul, already, which is relationship to government. One of the things I notice with my Scottish friends in Loch Lomond and the Cairngorms National Parks is that they have a very close relationship with ministers in the Scottish government. They're engaged directly in the impact of the spending review, whereas with DEFRA, we have a more arm's length relationship. So one of the things I'd seek is a better and closer relationship with the government bit that looks after us. The second point is being imaginative. So I mentioned that we don't have the struct, we only have one lock, but we do have a lot of dredging to do. And the way, I want to mention that other dreaded word, which is Brexit. One of the ways in which we've managed to be imaginative in terms of getting resource to carry out that statutory function has been working in partnership with colleagues in Holland, Germany, France, Belgium, Denmark. So we used to have a project called Prisma. We're now running one called Canopy. And I think we've got to look hard at what resources are made available post-Brexit for the sorts of activity that we were able to fund through European funding.
Thank you, John. Mark Stoneham, I'll bring you in first.
Thanks. I mean, thanks. As just as I said earlier, we're not receiving any direct funding from local government, etc. What we found is that with all the pressures of COVID in 2020, that our canal became a lifesaver for many people in terms of somewhere for people to walk and to cycle, and it gave us an opportunity to platform fundraising. And I was a little cynical as to how much money would be raised and how many people were out there, but I've been pleasantly surprised with how we've started. And therefore, COVID has been a help in this regard. It has shown people the value of what we're offering, and we're going to keep pushing that hard so that we can do the essential work we need to do to maintain the canal and the local banks.
Good. Mark?
Yeah, we've got a similar story here at the Grand Western, because it's been so well used and so greatly appreciated by local people. I think it's gone up in people's estimation. A lot of people, local people even that weren't using the canal, have been this year. So we're really hopeful that that will keep the pressure on the local politicians to keep the funding up. As far as the kind of bigger capital works side of things, obviously we had a very big wake-up call in 2012 with the breach. So I don't think there's any doubt that Devon County knows that it needs to maintain the asset of the canal, in order to do its job properly in being a responsible owner of the canal. So yeah, that's the points I'd make.
Thank you. And in the last 5 minutes or so, just as we go over time, and thank you for everyone that's staying on the call. Apologies if you have to go at 8:30, but stick with us if you can. A question has partly been aimed at me, and should IWA be campaigning for central government funding for all navigation authorities on the basis of public benefit? We've heard that story, that we should be seeing funding for the national ecosystem. What are your thoughts on that? I know what my thoughts are, but I'm happy to put that back out. James, where do you see IWA's role in engaging with national and even potentially local government?
Well, I've always seen IWA as a campaigning organisation. It essentially saved the waterways, didn't it? Arguably. So this seems like an opportune moment for the IWA to step forward and have those conversations again. Particularly for the smaller waterways that aren't centrally funded. It's something I would say, though, is, and though we all struggle for revenue funding, I think all of us around the table have said we struggle for revenue funding. Perhaps the ask is actually for capital to develop projects so we can self-fund, so that it's sustainable for the future. And that's what I would sort of actively seek from central government, is actually sort of capital grants to allow us to fund ourselves for the future, so that we're not coming cap in hand to them again in the future.
Thank you, Mark Baker. I'll bring you in on that too.
Yeah, well, I agree with James. I think that that's a sensible way. I can't think of any other mechanism whereby the government could fund navigations, but helping us to help ourselves seems sensible. I think the problem that we would often have with those sorts of funding schemes is just having the capacity to work up an application. So I think any such scheme would need to provide funding for somebody for extra resource to help work up such applications, because, as I say, we're flat out as it stands. So yeah, I think that's a good call from James there. I think there's other bodies campaigning for the same thing in parks and green spaces around the country. They're facing a similar uncertain future, greatly appreciated by people during COVID, but at risk of losing their funding, you know, when you know, cuts have to be made. So it's possible that having a wider collaboration with other organisations across those sectors might be worthwhile. I can think of the National Federation of Parks and Green Spaces. They're calling for the provision of green spaces to be made a statutory obligation for local authorities. So maybe that's something the IWA could explore, or individual canal trusts potentially. So yeah, collaboration across green spaces as well.
Thank you. That's useful. John Packman, briefly on this one as well.
At the beginning, Paul, you mentioned how awful COVID has been. One of the little benefits has resulted in greater contact with DEFRA officials, and Alison has been a trooper in terms of supporting and helping us with that. So I think the idea of collaborating together to make a case very much along the lines that James is outlining, I like that idea of helping us to help ourselves. You know, it is a public benefit. But I think the IWA, in that supportive role that Alison has played through the engagement over COVID, is absolutely very welcome.
Great. Well, we'll certainly be continuing that, and I think being able, as we've done in areas such as restoration, where we've been able to help others come together, provide shared services, capability. There's way too much to do for any one of us to think we can do it on our own, and doing it together is key. And the strength of the voice in working together really comes through clearly. I'm just going to, just in the last dying minutes, just raise a couple more questions that have come up. I don't think there's really been any mention of lottery funding tonight. Is that because a lot of it is focused on heritage and restoration? What are your thoughts on that? Mark Stoneham, I'll bring you in and just see if you've any experience on that one.
So I think when we've done our research, it's tended to seem that the lottery is funding bigger projects, as you say, regeneration type projects, and not the sort of things that we're looking to spend our money on, i.e. maintaining banks and dredging the waterways. So we actually had a conversation with someone from the lottery, and that gave the impression that significant size grants were really what they were looking to do. So we thought we were out of scope, but I'll be delighted to be proved wrong if others can tell me.
Any other experiences, James?
Yes, I think our experience with lottery grants is we've gone for a couple and not got them because there were some very strict hoops to jump through in terms of delivering certain things for in terms of the grant givers' requirements in terms of heritage or education or things like that. And again, they only fund capital projects, which you know, we call them capital, but what I'm thinking about is capital for projects that will go on then generating income. The lottery doesn't seem to be that keen on those kind of projects.
Thank you. John?
We're running a major lottery-funded water mills and marshes scheme, which is a landscape partnership, and that's very much focused on heritage, on restoring the important mills that drain the Broads. one of the difficulties we have with our navigation function is that generally those sorts of funding sources don't support statutory functions. So our big issues like dredging, it's very difficult to persuade those sort of funders to fund that key function of our responsibility.
Thank you. So we're just about to run out of time, and what I would like to do, just as we close, just give each of you like literally 30 seconds, 40 at the max, in relation to funding and the whole underfunding question. What's your wish list? If we had DEFRA, head of the lottery fund, if I was sitting here with a big pot of funding, what would you be saying tonight? Mark Stoneham, we'll start with you. Mark, you mute.
Oh, apologies. So I guess our needs are clear. We identified the banks as a priority, and dredging is our next priority. Our assets will last for the next few years and will continue to generate income. And I would be keen for us to go up and say, you know, let's see what money we can get into the area, because every day I read about another organisation that's going up for money, and why wouldn't we be in there too? Is where I would be. But that's my opinion.
Thank you, Mark Baker.
Well, I guess we just need some recognition for the fantastic role that we play. You know, the huge array of benefits that the Waterways brings, the benefits to the local economy, for people's health and well-being. I'd like to see a way that we can actually receive funding for the benefits that we have in terms of health and well-being. Apart from potentially some capital funding for improving the towpath, there's very little that I've managed to find in terms of tapping into funding. You know, it seems to be assumed that the canal's there, the towpath's there for people to use to improve their health and well-being, but there's no mechanism for funding it. So finding a way to make that link would be good.
Right, James.
I would agree with Mark. It's tapping into all those social benefits that the waterways provide in terms of health and well-being and exercise, and green spaces and natural capital. I would like to see some mechanism put in place to help those authorities that are providing those services, help them pay for that, whether that be through some kind of central government grant, or whether it's through capital grants to give us, to allow us to do projects to generate income in the future that don't require us then to go back to government. I think it'd be that I would be asking for.
Right, and finally, back to you, John.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, whereas it would be nice to have some capital money for things like new moorings and dredging, I think if I had to pick one specific thing out, it would be the greening of boating. It'd be looking towards the future. So one of the things I would like to build is a new mud wherry to take our dredge material to where it's deposited, powered by hydrogen. We've been doing some work with the University of Birmingham. We've got a price for doing it and we can't afford it. So that would be my top priority. It's not core maintenance stuff, but it's the way the world has got to go. And although COVID is a crisis now, the climate crisis is upon us as well.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. We're definitely over time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to working with you all in the future. And I think if there's one message that's come through loud and clear tonight, is that we need to convince those who could be funding us of the incredible value that our waterways offer to the nation, to the economy, and to our citizens who are hard pressed after an incredibly difficult year, where the waterways have proved themselves to be a really strong outlet and a real relief and a restorative part of their lives. So thank you for all that you do. I look forward to working with you. thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight, because I think to pick up on the point that's been made, you are recognised for the work you're doing, if only in the number of people that have joined us for this tonight. It's been great to see so many. Thank you for giving up your evening as attendees for this, and to our speakers, thank you. I look forward to catching up with you again. Good night, everyone. See you soon.